My name is Fiona Jelly. I'm the CEO and founder of Comply First, and I'll be hosting today's session. And joining me is Nora Beausang from Simmons Simmons, who will guide us through the key consumer protection changes which are going live in Ireland at the end of March. Welcome, Nora.
Thank you. Nice to be here, Fiona.
Great to have you. So in terms of today's session, we'll cover three key things. We will cover what the CBI is saying about consumer protection more broadly in its latest Regulatory and Supervisory Outlook, which was published just 26th of February. Second, we are going to give you a quick overview of the new CPC regime and bust some of the common myths that we're hearing out in the market. And finally, we are going to finish up with a short demo of Simmons Simmons CPC tool, so you can see how firms are actually operationalizing these new requirements in practice. And just to say very quickly up front, CPC isn't something we directly support at Comply First, but we wanted to provide value by flagging this to you, guys and bringing in the experts at Simmons Simmons to walk through what it means for PIs and EMIs in practice. So just a couple of quick housekeeping points before we start. Firstly, this webinar is for general information only. It's not legal advice, so please double check with your legal team before relying on anything we cover today. And second, if you have any questions, just feel free to drop them in the chat throughout and we'll handle them at the end. Now, before we start, let me just quickly introduce ourselves. So as I said, I'm Fiona Jelly, CEO and founder of Comply First. I have about 12 years of experience in your shoes, working in various compliance roles at Goldman Sachs, Citibank, and fintechs. I'm also a barrister in England and Wales and a certified anti-money laundering specialist. And joining us, as I said, is Nora from Simmons Simmons. She is a senior financial services regulatory expert at Simmons Simmons and brings over 20 years experience advising regulated firms. She has also previously served as a head of legal and regulatory risk at a major division of a pillar bank, and she is admitted as a solicitor in Ireland and New Zealand. So thank you very much again for joining us today, Nora.
Thanks, Fiona.
So before we get into it, guys, I'd love to get a quick sense of how you're all feeling in the room. So here is a quick poll for everyone today. How ready do you feel for the new Consumer Protection Code changes going live at the end of March? Just take 10 seconds to vote now. Okay, and I think we'll just wrap up voting now. Okay, and we're sharing the results with you guys. So as you can see, the majority of you feel somewhat ready, but are still working through a few things, and kind of even split between fully ready and just getting started. So the full spectrum here with us today. And if we just go back to the slides, perfect. So before we get into the actual content of the CPC itself, we thought it would be helpful to take a moment and zoom out and see what the CBI are actually signaling in terms of consumer protection more broadly. Nora, could you walk us through what the CBI has been signaling in their recent Regulatory and Supervisory Outlook Report and what PIs and EMIs might expect to be tested on?
Sure. Thank you, Fiona. Okay, so the Central Bank's Outlook Report was published at the end of last month. It's very topical. And they set out sectoral areas for priority focus in each of the industry sectors, including the payment and e-money sector. And there were 4 issues that they called out. One, and they repeatedly call this out, is that customer interests, they feel, are not embedded in either board level or day-to-day decision making. And they see growth objectives often taking priority over customer outcomes. They also repeatedly link weak governance to poor outcomes. So they talk about poor customer service, operational errors, unclear or ineffective customer communications, and failure to identify and appropriately support consumers in vulnerable circumstances. And we'll come back to that one. They talk about complaints handling still not working. And they say that firms aren't recognizing expressions of dissatisfaction as complaints. They don't fix root causes. And this leads to repeat issues and unnecessary escalation to the FSPO, the Financial Services and Pensions Ombudsman, which can be a real time waster. Board accountability, they say, is non-negotiable. They want to be able to see boards and senior management demonstrating effective management of risk and governance that actively secures consumers' interests, regardless of the size or complexity or the group structure. And so the key takeaway here is that growth in the payment and e-money sector without strong governance and customer-centered decision-making will just not be accepted by the central bank. Now, in terms of their priority areas of focus, they talk about, and most of this is for this year, they talk about the cross-sectoral thematic review of whether customers are being informed effectively. We'll come back to that. They want to see a root cause analysis of errors and the application of learnings. That's very important to them. Cross-sectoral thematic review of the identification and treatment of vulnerable consumers. That's also for this year, but also heading into next year. Into next year, then, assessment of board composition, resourcing levels and governance structures, and also into next year, thematic review of the operation of distributor and agent models. So that is the high-level call-outs from the report.
Very helpful, Nora. So consumer protection is clearly very important to the Central Bank of Ireland, and they've also signalled how they will test firms on it, which is very helpful. Now, turning to the actual consumer protection regime itself, could you give us a high-level overview of the new regime?
Sure. So I'll run through this quickly, but it's important to know the distinction between the two limbs, particularly as they apply to PIs and EMIs. So first of all, you've got Standards for Business Regulations 2025. They've been called principles based and high level, but actually when you operationalise them on foot of the guidance that the CBI has given, they're not. They're actually quite granular. They can be divided into two sets: customer-facing standards and systems and control-related requirements. Now, in terms of the customer-facing standards, there's that requirement to secure consumers' interests. That applies only to consumers. We'll come on to the distinction between consumers and customers in a minute. There's also, and these requirements apply to all customers, requirement to act with integrity, skill and care, prioritise best interests, communicate in a way that enables effective consumer understanding and counter financial abuse. The next ones are the systems and controls related requirements. And these require firms to control and manage their affairs and systems sustainably, responsibly, and in a sound and prudent manner to maintain adequate financial resources, and importantly, to engage and cooperate with the central bank and competent authorities in good faith and without delay. So just to recap, all of those apply to all customers, other than the requirement to secure consumer interests and also to counter financial abuse. They apply to consumers only. Then the consumer protection regulations, these are detailed, prescriptive, and operationally demanding. And part 2, which applies to PIs and EMIs, introduce extensive requirements in relation to consumers in vulnerable circumstances, digitalisation, regulated versus unregulated activities, conflicts of interest, and complaints and errors management. So just one other point I wanted to make before we get into the myth busting is really, and it's as a counterbalance to everything else we're saying, firms are allowed and expected to pursue their commercial objectives. It is not the case that they should be required to apply unduly burdensome or costly application. Their focus of the central bank is on what's reasonable and foreseeable. So firms are expected to assess the outcomes that may reasonably result from their actions based on what they can know and influence at the time, and also the particular role that they carry out. So, for example, in the context of consumers in vulnerable circumstances, where you're executing payment transactions, you know, there's a limit to how much you will know about the consumer, obviously, but you are required to put in place arrangements that reflect the service that you provide. For example, having adequate supports in place, having support channels, having alternatives where that is appropriate, and also training your staff to identify indicators of vulnerability. For example, scenarios where they contact you and clearly exhibit distress. So again, we're talking about a proportionate application, the application of judgment. So what we're talking about is defensible decision making, not risk elimination, not commercial paralysis, and perfection is not the required standard.
Perfect. So basically have a clear and defensible risk customer risk assessment for this, and you can't really go too far wrong, I would say, Nora. Okay, now on to the fun part. We're going to have a quick fire round on 4 myths that we are commonly hearing at the minute with regards to the CPC. Nora, so the first one up is the CPC doesn't apply to B2B business models. Can you comment on that one for us?
Yes, I will bust that myth, Fiona. Consumer Protection Code is a misnomer. Despite the name, the CPC isn't just about consumers. It applies across the gamut of B2B and wholesale business models. Now, 2 areas in which the CPC bites in a business context. First of all, we spoke about part 2 of the Consumer Protection Regulations. They apply in addition to all individuals, which would include sole traders, also corporates with an annual turnover of up to 5 million in the previous financial year. So those requirements, other than, I should say, the requirements dealing with consumers in vulnerable circumstances, which apply to individuals mainly. The rest of them, for example, conflicts of interest, digitalization, regulated versus unregulated activities, errors, complaints, they all apply to corporates up to that annual threshold. Then the standards for business, they apply to all customers. So these are the entity equivalent of the conduct standards under the individual accountability framework. They apply to wholesale and B2B relationships. Now, just to be aware, there is an exception here. The requirements dealing with securing consumer interests and financial abuse deal with CPC consumers only. So that's the individuals and the corporates up to that 5 million threshold, not all customers.
Okay, super clear and myth firmly busted, I would say. Now on to the second one, which I've heard quite a lot. We're probably doing this somehow or somewhere. You know, for example, we're PSD2 compliant. Do firms need to be thinking about CPC as a standalone priority?
Yes, again, I'm busting the myth. The CPC is not a PSD2 bolt-on. The central bank is very, very proud of its Consumer Protection Code. It's entirely domestic. They say it sits at the centerpiece of its consumer protection framework in Ireland. So it is a common pitfall to think, oh, we have a sectoral regime that has conduct requirements, for example, PSD2 or MICR. And it is the case that some requirements are switched off under the CPC. Some of the informing effectively requirements are, because there is requirements under the PSD that deals with that. But just to be clear, that for PIs and EMIs, EU compliance, including PSD2, is not enough. The CPC is a standalone conduct regime that sits at the centre of the CBI's consumer protection framework. It's very much its focus.
Very clear, Nora. And quickly on to our third quickfire round. If we comply with the UK consumer duty, we're probably already covered.
Right. And this is a core area of sensitivity and irritation for the Central Bank of Ireland, as any of us who've been at the cold phase of engagement with them will know. They are intensely irritated if you provide them with policies and procedures that relate clearly to another jurisdiction. Their view, and quite reasonably in fairness, is that if you're an Irish regulated firm or a firm that is authorised to do business in Ireland, dealing with Irish resident consumers, you comply with the Irish Consumer Protection Framework, which includes the CPC. So to be clear, the UK consumer duty will help. So there are areas that it will definitely help in, for example, governance, consumer risk thinking, product design. But the CPC introduces distinct, enforceable, granular and prescriptive requirements that just can't be avoided in relation to areas like financial abuse, digitalization, consumers in vulnerable circumstances, strict separation of regulated and unregulated activities, complaints and errors handling. The central bank will expect to see in your policies, your processes and your operations the CPC specific themes reflected.
Totally. I can almost see CBI rolling their eyes at that myth. So thanks for that, Nora. Very clear. And the last one, the standards of business are just too high a level to really be enforced. What do you think about that one?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. And just quickly, we're seeing that thinking in the market. Oh, and this is from people perhaps who are new entrants who maybe wouldn't have been alive to the tracker mortgage investigations. Just to be clear, the standards for business are the expanded version of the general principles of the CPC 2012. And those general principles, which were much more high level than what we will now have under the standards for business, were essentially the sole basis for the imposition of sanctions under the tracker mortgage investigation. So that resulted in fines of 274 million imposed on 5 lenders and a directed redress program of almost 1 billion. It was 900 million. Also to be aware that the IIF, the Individual Accountability Framework, and now applies. And for those banks that are listening, the SEER framework applies. So under the IAF, PCFs and CF1s must take reasonable steps to ensure that their firms comply with financial services legislation. That includes the CPC, it includes the standards for business. And the key takeaway is that breaches of the standards for business or the consumer protection regulations can lead to sanctions and other issues against both the firms and senior individuals. And also just to make the point that any sort of engagement with the central bank on conduct issues and RMPs and the like, they're an incredibly time-consuming exercise. So really, get it right at the start. One and done, and getting it right at the start and then keeping it right is just very, very important.
Yeah, you don't want to end up in the crosshairs of enforcement, and it's clear from those fines that it does have bite. That's really clear. And those are our 4 myths busted, Nora, and I'm clear that you've prepared a short practical compliance snapshot for firms, which we're showing here on screen. This is something that teams can take away, and we'll send the slides afterwards and they can use it internally as a discussion and preparation aid. But I guess if I could ask you one question, what is the one thing that heads of compliance should take away from today's session?
And it is, Fiona, the securing consumer interests, which applies to all individuals and corporates up to that 5 million threshold. So basically, this is a new requirement. It has been the focus of standalone guidance from the central bank. They are extremely focused on it. They've specifically called it out in relation to PIs and EMIs, in relation to decision making. So the questions that we would ask is securing consumer interest, is that clearly owned and understood across your business? Is it defined, or are you leaving your staff to infer what it means? Have you reflected the CBI guidance, the Consumer Protection Risk Assessment Guidance, which was published in 2017, and the central bank has said has to be read in conjunction with the Securing Consumer Interest Guidance, the CBI General Guidance, and the CBI Dear CEO letters. In your policies, procedures, strategies, operations and decision making, and can you evidence where consumer interest influenced real decisions? They're not going to be taking your policies away for a desktop review. They want to see how securing consumer interests have influenced real decision making across your business.
And this is the test, really, isn't it, Nora? Do you want to speak to this one?
Yeah. So basically, this is the reality check, and it actually reflects the wording of one of the supporting standards to the securing consumer interest requirement in the standards for business. So can you show the CBI how consumer interests are embedded across your governance, decisions, and outcomes with evidence aligned to the 26-27 supervisory timetable?
Perfect. We will leave heads of compliance to sort of mull that one over. And now, I guess, speaking from my own experience as a former head of compliance, you read all the regulations, the legislation and the guidance, but it always comes down to this: how do I operationalize this quickly and practically? And you and the team at Simmons Simmons have a tool that helps firms do just that. So I'd like to hand over to you, Nora, just to walk us through some of the key features of that tool, and then maybe give us a quick 5-minute demo.
Okay, thank you, Fiona. So first of all, I wanted to talk about basically two aspects, right? One is the translation of the CPC 2025 requirements. And the second is securing consumer interest before we go on to the demo. So what we felt was very important was that we didn't just look at the requirements. We felt it was really important to get the action points to operationalize the code extracted from the CBI's commentary and guidance that's set out in its securing consumer interest guidance, its vulnerable consumer guidance, its Dear CEO letters, its general guidance. And what we wanted to do was to translate them into clear, operable action points. We wanted to make it as seamless as possible for your firms to be able to operationalize the code. In terms of securing consumer interests, and this is a difficult one, and we've seen across the market that it's been a difficult one for people to operationalize. What we've done is we have distilled the securing consumer interest guidance into a group of core deliverables. And what we've done is we've set the foundation, we've defined securing consumer interests, we've recommended that a securing consumer interest policy be approved. We've actually done the definition, we've done a template securing consumer interest policy. Then we have a group of core deliverables under the heading of embedding consumer interest into your culture, strategy, operations, governance and controls. So for example, we've identified consumer protection risks. We've done a template. We've done a template consumer protection risk appetite statement. There's various other granular action points that we've set out under that heading. And the users who are using it are finding it extremely useful in terms of operationalizing what can be seen as a very high level requirement. We then have a group of requirements under the heading of securing consumer interests when designing financial services, applying securing consumer interests where consumers actually experience the firm at sales and post-sales stages, digitalization. So how do you secure consumer interest when your delivery method is mainly or solely through digital channels, which would be very relevant here. And then a group of final deliverables around acting in accordance with the reasonable expectations of consumers, errors and complaints handling, distinction between regulated and unregulated activities, and delivering fair consumer outcomes. So we've gone from the top down and the bottom up in terms of seeking to operationalize those requirements. Now, we can go into a demo now, if that works.
Please, yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to enable screen sharing. And we now should see, let me know if it doesn't come up.
Yeah.
It's up. The Simmons product platform. And so here we have the CPC tools. So this is the Simmons, so every user can just go straight onto this. If you go into the content, and if you go into the entities, so here we'll pick e-money firm and we pick products and services. So we pick payment and services. In fact, payment services and e-money services would be exactly the same here because the same exclusions apply. Then we'll take consumers in vulnerable circumstances. And you only need to have 3 fields filled out before you get your results. So you can see the subtopic regulation number and impact level there. So what comes up is the regulations around consumers in vulnerable circumstances. If we take regulation 36, which deals with the trusted contact person requirement, and if you're dealing with personal consumers, there will be an expectation that you have this capability embedded in your policies and procedures. So it's an ability to appoint a trusted contact person. What we have is a summary statement, action points, which are the core of our tool, and then a description of changes, which actually it sets out all of the guidance, etc. We don't necessarily want you to look at that or need you to look at that. We have distilled this guidance into these action items. So, for example, there is a requirement for where a trusted contact person is appointed, a consent to be signed by both the personal consumer and the trusted contact person. We've drafted the consent, and it's ready to be copied and pasted into your own procedures, or you can select the action item here and send the selected item to your own inbox. So it's completely ready. And just a point we should make is that this tool is used out in the market. It is heavily used. So we have the stats. So we can see that it's operable, it's user friendly. People are using the output. Just to explain a couple of other features very quickly, there's the old text where it applies, the new text, and then there's a red line. So that, for example, sets out the distinction between the 2012 Consumer Protection Code and the 2025 Consumer Protection Code. That's just an example of one regulation, and we've done that output for every regulation in Part 2 of the Consumer Protection Regulations, also Part 3, which doesn't apply to EMIs and PIs, and also the standards for business. Okay, so I think I can stop sharing now.
Perfect. Very helpful, Nora. The three things that I like about that are the red line, as you say, the templates straight out of the box that can be customized, and the action points. So that really helps firms operationalize this. I guess before we move to Q&A, one quick final poll that will run. If you'd like the Simmons and Simmons team to follow up with you after the session, just select yes in the poll, and we'll give you a few seconds to respond now. Okay, we're going to wrap it up in about 3 or 4 seconds. Perfect. Let's and now, guys, I think we're going to move to a very quick round of questions. If you have any questions for Nora, pop them in the chat now, and we will tackle as many as we can. Nora, should Irish legal entities complaints policy be standalone policy rolling up to the Irish board, or can it be part of a group policy rolling up to a board outside of Ireland? Do you have any views?
Yeah, I mean, again, we're back to this. You're an Irish regulated firm and run by an Irish board. So the Irish legal entities complaints policy should actually roll to the Irish board. There are governance requirements around, for example, errors in the consumer protection regulations. So my strong advice to you would be to have a complaints policy rolling up to the Irish board. It could incorporate aspects or be based on aspects of your group policy, as long as it reflects the requirements of the consumer protection regulations and it goes to your Irish board.
Perfect. One more there, Nora. Would merchants part of the acquiring process be deemed as corporates for the purposes of CPC?
Well, I guess it depends on the nature of the service that you're providing. If you're providing a payment service and the customer, the user, is your merchant, and I guess that just depends on the nature of the transaction, well, then it would be a corporate. But if you're not actually providing a service to the merchant, then it wouldn't. So it's basically your regulated activity. Are you providing payment services under PSD2 to the merchant? If you are, it's within the scope of the Consumer Protection Code. If you're not, it's not.
Okay, and I think we have time for one more question before we wrap up. If there, it may be that is. I think that's good for now, Nora. I think that is enough for today. And I guess with that, we'll wrap up today's session. A very big thank you to you all for joining us. We really appreciate you taking the time. I hope you find it useful. Huge thank you to Nora for joining us and helping unpack the new CPC. If you'd like to get in touch with Nora or myself after the session, our contact details are on the screen now. And yeah, thank you very much. And hopefully we'll see you at another webinar or event very soon.
Thank you, Fiona.
We'll follow up with the slides afterwards. Okay, thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Cheers.